Hello, everybody. How's it going? Thank you very much for joining me today. I might drag this over to the other screen and let these last few people in. So there's quite a few familiar names in the list today, but for those who haven't met me before, my name's Tom and I work with the client engagement team here at aXcelerate, and I assist with training as need be, which is why I'm here today to discuss finance within aXcelerate. Now, this is the first of two sessions that we can see on the screen. What we're going to be doing today is having a very overarching look at finance in aXcelerate, what this means, and the basics of setting this up. In our subsequent session, which is going to be hosted in 2 days at the same time, we're going to be looking at creating an invoice for a student and sending it to them. So in terms of what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to start off by talking about what is finance in aXcelerate. I'm going to be covering some very important system settings that need to be set before finance in aXcelerate can be utilized. We're then going to have a look at the finance tab that you can see from your dashboard and what the various buttons mean, or options, I should say, and which ones are relevant for what we're talking about today. And we're going to finish off with a brief summary and explanation of what we're going to be achieving in the follow-up session. So if you guys do have any questions for me today, feel free to pop them in the chat. And at the end of the session, we'll have a bit of a Q&A where I can sit down and see if you guys have any good questions. So to get started, I'm going to jump into aXcelerate. And this is the aXcelerate account that we've been using for the training, which is going to help with continuity. Now, what is finance in aXcelerate? Finance is sending invoices to students. It's charging them appropriately for the studies they are partaking in. We look at being able to split the cost of studies between students and an employer, for example, and the options we have relating to that. We also have the ability, of course, to send invoice and send credit notes from aXcelerate. But those latter two are going to be covered more in our upcoming session. Now, we need, before we can even look at finance, we need to set up some system settings. So firstly, hover over settings, and we're going to go into system settings, and we're going to go to the additional options tab here. Now, the additional options tab includes, oh, my internet's being very slow today. Sorry, guys. The additional options tab allows us to set what is called an invoice seed. Now, an invoice seed is essentially the number that get generated when an invoice is issued. Now, this is annoying. This doesn't want to load for me. What we're going to be looking at is how we set these up, how we can put in prefixes. So by default, I believe the prefix for invoices is AX, meaning that if you were to create your first invoice, it might be AX 00001. We're able to customize the amount of digits in there, or referred to as the padding. And we're also going to be looking at, here we go. Sorry, just admitting somebody else. We're also going to be looking at how we can set up the same, but for credit notes. Now, I don't know what's going on here, guys. I'm not sure if this is my internet or if it's just to do with my account. Just bear with me for one moment. I'm going to try it in another tab, see if that helps. Here we go. This is what I'm after. So we're now in our additional options within our system settings. And what I'm going to highlight here are these three fields. So the invoice number prefix, just like I said, are the letters that come at the start of the invoice number. So what we have set up here is ASD, we have an invoice number padding of 1 and an invoice seed of 12. So that doesn't make too much sense at the moment, but let's tie it all together. When an invoice seed is 12, that means the first ever invoice that you're going to generate in aXcelerate is going to be simply labeled ASD 0, and there's a 10 because we've selected 1, 12. So ASD 012 would be what our first ever invoice is called. Our second invoice would be ASD 013, so on and so forth. You're essentially setting the first number that your subsequent invoices are going to build off. Now, the reason this is important and the reason I've labeled it crucial system settings is you cannot change the invoice number seed once it has been entered. You'll see there's a padlock here. You can't change this because you'll see it causes massive problems if you have another finance system, because we need to make sure that invoice numbers are trackable and are in a methodical, understandable order. So if you're setting this up for the first time, stop, do not save anything, and chat to your finance team first, because they'll definitely want to give you some input in this regard. Now, scrolling down, default invoice due date offset. 7 days means that if I issue an invoice, in 7 days, that invoice is going to be due. If I hit 30, in 30 days, that invoice is going to be due. Of course, this can be overridden and changed invoice to invoice. This is just the default value we're setting today. Now, overwrite invoice date when finalizing. This means that if you've gone in and you've applied a change to an invoice and then you've finalized it, it's going to update the invoice date to be that new finalized date. So it completely depends up to your, or depends on your organization, whether you would like yes or no here. Now, finance codes, we're going to be having a look at these in this session later on, but I'll just mention that you can set up a postage fee. So for example, if you're mailing your invoices and you charge $1 to the student to receive that by paper, you can set that up as a finance code, which automatically gets added to each invoice. We'll have a look at that very shortly. Now, credit notes, you'll see that these fields are very similar to the invoice fields above. That's because they're very similar. You need to do this in order to set up credit notes. So I'm not going to go into what is an invoice versus what's a credit note. You guys should be familiar with that, but do understand that before credit notes can be issued from aXcelerate, you do need to set up these 3 options here, just like you need to do so for invoices before they can be sent. Now, those are the system settings that I wanted to have a look at. So we're going to have a look at the finance tab at the top. Now, immediately at a glance, a lot of you watching this will think, oh, I've got different options on my screen. That's because in this demonstration account, I've enabled all of our options. However, I'm only going to be showing you the relevant ones and the most important ones for what we're discussing today. We're going to start off with finance management. So in here, this is your world of invoicing. Any invoice that has ever been issued to a student can be seen in here. Any draft invoices that haven't yet been issued can also be sent in here. You can look at or record whether any payments have been received, so on and so forth. Now, we're going to be looking at this in more depth in our next session, because we're going to be setting up a real example where we're issuing an invoice to a student. And that's going to be the best time for us to look at invoices. So we will be coming back to this. It's a very important part of finance, but I'm now going to move on to the other options. Now, zero import export. This option is available to our turbo clients for free, a zero integration, or for a one-off fee to our standard clients. And what this lets you do is essentially take your finance information from aXcelerate, copy it into Xero, take your finance data from Xero, copy it into aXcelerate. So the two systems can transfer information back and forth from one another. But it's very important to understand they are two different systems, and the invoice number and details are what they use to match the information. So tying back into the system settings we were looking at earlier, if you're interested in a Xero or MYOB integration, for example, you should set up your finance or your codes in aXcelerate to be exactly like they are in your finance system. Now, monthly targets, we're not going to be looking at today because it's the more advanced side of reporting. We're going to come down to the item list. Now, what the item list lets us do is essentially charge a fee to students for anything we want. Now, when I say anything we want, it could be a physical object like a textbook that we're selling them. It could be a processing fee for the admin team. We can set these up. So for example, I'm going to call this let's go first aid textbook. And I'm going to call this FAT and put in the code for that particular qualification. These are not reported on. This is purely just how you want to label them. But keep in mind, if you are storing this information in a third-party finance software, your item code and description will need to match that in your other system. Now, finance codes, we're actually going to be looking at this shortly. So I'm going to brush over this for now, but we'll come back and explain it shortly. Now, this is where we enter the price, in this case for the first aid textbook. And I'm going to say it's a $60 textbook, excluding GST. Look, we're not going to include any postage costs because we're going to be handing it to the students in the course. Display on website, image, and item description all tie into your online enrollments. And if this is a product you advertise as selling on your website, this won't be too applicable in many situations. So I'm going to leave these blank and submit. So what we've done here is we have created a first aid textbook, and we could just simply add that item to a student's invoice. Finance codes are used to essentially categorize what a fee would be. So an example is I might have a finance code called stationery, and that is where the first aid textbook is housed under. To make a bit more of sense of that, let's go into finance codes, and I'm going to add a new code. Now, domain, I'm not going to worry about that today. It won't be too applicable for the majority of our invoice. I'm looking at the words on the screen and I'm saying what I'm seeing. Sorry, guys, that's not the right word. So, description. I'm going to call this stationery/workbooks. And finance code, I'm going to call this STWO, for example. That's just how I've decided to label it. You guys could use a string of numbers if you wanted to. It really just comes down to how you guys want to store this information. A subcode is just if you wanted an additional code, to be relevant. So like if you had, for example, a stationery workbook code that was for selling stationery and workbooks of your first aid kind, then you could use a subcode to say, this one's for first aid, This one's for work health and safety sort of thing. It's just another way that you can categorize that information. Till code and cost center code, I'll be brushing over today. If you are familiar with what these mean, it means you need to add it. If you're not, it means you can very likely skip past it. It's just for internal recording purposes. Now use this finance code as a default for. Now this is an interesting option. If I click in-house workshops, what this means is that if I am enrolling a student into an in-house workshop that they have to pay for, on their invoice, the fee for their, or the charge for their in-house workshop is going to appear underneath the stationery/workbooks finance code. Obviously, we don't want that. What we would do in this situation would call it extra items. So that way, when a student's looking at their invoice, they will see extra items as the finance code, or whatever we've called here, and that will include all the extra items. It's essentially just a way for you to break down the payment summary for the students and also for your own internal record keeping. So I'm now going to scroll down and submit this. So we've just set up the stationery and workbook finance code. So I'm going to go back into our item list and have a look at this first aid one that we just created. Just move myself out of the way and drag myself back if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Finance code, stationery and workbooks, submit. So in summary, what we've done there is when we're charging students for a workbook, in this case, a first aid workbook, on their invoice, it's going to appear underneath the stationery and workbook category. And of course, the reason this is so powerful is you can run reports to see how many people have bought particular items or how many people have bought stationery from you guys. So if you're tracking this information accurately, it is just so powerful for your own record keeping purposes. Everything is always tracked. So I strongly recommend to all our clients that if you're utilizing the finance side of aXcelerate, that you really fully utilize it, meaning you set up item list, finance codes, and finance models. How smooth was that transition? So finance models can be used to basically set up tuition fees in aXcelerate. So for example, you might have a concession finance model and a non-concession finance model. So I'm going to set up two examples here. I'm going to set up a fee for service domestic student finance model. Now, what we're doing here is we're ticking who gets essentially charged for this student's studies. If I click on student funded and I change this to percentage, for example, and make it 100%, that means that if we apply this finance model to a particular student's enrollment, they're paying 100% of that tuition fee. We might have an example where an employer has offered to subsidize some of the student's fee. In that case, you could tick employer, say, look, they're going to take 25% of the fee and the student's going to take 75% of the fee. Keeping in mind, if you're using the percentage option, the totals have to hit 100%. You can't just put in 75% for the student and then just click save. It'll go, hey, whoa, where's that last 25%? If you're using value, you can type in the specific dollar value that you would like to charge the student. Now, this is interesting because what we actually looked at in an earlier qualification session and what we're going to be looking at further in our next finance session is being able to set up course or qualification fees at the qualification level. So if we do that, we don't need to enter the value. We can simply go off the percentage. But for this example, let's go with a value. So I might say the student pays $1,000 per qualification. They might pay $100 per unit of competency. It just really depends how you guys want to break down the description of or how students are charged. So some people might charge them, like $15 per nominal hour they study. You might prefer to just charge them a lump sum for the entire qualification. Now, additional items. So if, for example, here we go, I'm going to set this up as, here we go, a certificate 3 in dental assisting, and I could add the first aid textbook as a required inclusion. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying, if the student's studying this qualification, we want it so that it's student funded and they're paying $1,000 for the whole qualification. Now I might submit this. Oh, I must first select a state. Good point. I'm in Queensland. I'm going to select Queensland. Submit. Now I'm going to add a new finance model and I'm going to call this, we'll say fee for service, domestic, student, and then we'll say employer subsidized. Might help if I can spell when live in front of an audience. Qualification, I'm going to choose that first qualification. Sorry, that same one, just for continuity, also in Queensland. Now, for this one, we're going to charge the student $500 for their qualification. And we're then going to charge their employer $500 for the qualification as well. So we could come through, again, you can customize this however you want on both the student and the employer level. Just for the sake of the example today, I'm going to leave it as it is, and I'm going to click submit. These are now finance models that we have set up in aXcelerate, and we can now apply to classes. So for example, let's go into a class and let's have a look at the June intake that we've been looking at previously. I'm going to click on update. Finance model, you know what? I think I've jumped the gun there and we need to make a new class. Let's add a new class. And I'm going to choose, here we go. This is why I just confused myself. Sorry guys, give me a second. I'll explain what I'm doing here. Cool. So we couldn't set a finance model for that example class I was just looking at, because the qualification, a work health and safety certificate, didn't have any finance models. Whereas when I select the certificate 3 in dental assisting, which we just set up, you'll now see that finance models can be set. Now, what this means is if I clicked that employer subsidized one, every student that gets enrolled in this class is going to have 50% of the fee charged to them and 50% of the invoice charged to their designated employer. And that's something that's set up in their contact management that we looked at in our first refresher training session. Now we've applied this to the class, meaning that everyone who gets enrolled has this finance model applied to them. What we could then do is go into an enrollment within that class and apply a different finance model. So for example, you could say, yep, everyone in this class is getting a bit of employer subsidy in regards to their fee. But if there's one student who isn't, you can just go into their enrollment and change the finance model for that particular student. Now, there are a few other tabs: payment plans, contract reconciliation, and easy pay. We won't be looking at those today because they can be very complex sides of finance. And really, that brings what I wanted to cover today to a close. And I can see we've got a couple of comments in the chat, which I'll get to just at the end of. So I appreciate your continued patience, Natalie, while I work through this. So guys, what we've covered is I explained what finance is in aXcelerate and what can be achieved through the finance system. We looked at setting up invoice details such as the numbers padding. So if you've got 4 zeros, your padding would be 4, for example. We looked at setting up the seed number, which is the first number that all your subsequent invoices or credit notes are generated from. And I've also given you a basic overview of the finance tab and the most commonly utilized buttons within that tab. We briefly looked at finance management, but not too much. And again, I mentioned that's one of the largest areas of the finance system. So we're going to be, in our next session, looking at that in more depth. So we're going to be looking at how you can customize invoices in terms of putting new items on there, taking items off. We're going to look at setting up a qualification that has a cost associated with it, so that when we enroll a student into a class, that invoice is generated for them with the appropriate details. And we're going to look at sending that invoice as well. So this is very much so part 1 of part 2 of our finance training sessions. For those of you watching live, our next session is on Thursday, the 22nd of July at the same time. And of course, these are all being recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel as well. So thank you very much for your time, guys. It is, as always, greatly appreciated. I know that, sitting down and having someone talk at you for 30 minutes can be quite draining. So I very much so appreciate everyone's diligence in attending these sessions and wanting to learn more about the finance aspect of aXcelerate. So again, thanks for your time, guys. If you are watching this live, hang around for another couple of minutes because I'll do a bit of a Q&A. Otherwise, guys, thanks for watching. See you later.